All right, greetings, friends, and welcome to this episode of the Rob Breakenridge Show. So great to have you along with us. In this episode, a closer look at free trade and the Canada-U.S. relationship. We had some significant developments this week, but there are still a lot of questions moving forward about whether we're going to be able to preserve this trading relationship between Canada and the U.S. Amid reports that President Donald Trump is considering pulling out of the very trade deal that he negotiated, the USMCA, or what we refer to as CUSMA. Now, in the meantime, we're still waiting to see how the U.S. Supreme Court rules on some of these tariffs that Trump has imposed and use this argument of an emergency to justify those tariffs. Though we did see this week a significant vote in the U.S. House of Representatives, where a number of Republicans joined with Democrats to vote against those tariffs, or more specifically, to vote to end the emergency that has justified those tariffs. Now, Donald Trump wasn't happy about that, and he issued some threats against members of Congress who vote against those tariffs, but nonetheless, enough voted with Democrats. I think there were 6 Republicans voted with Democrats to vote against those tariffs. Now, Trump can still veto that decision, so it doesn't necessarily mean an end to tariffs or an end to this trade drama. And the other thing that happened this week concerns a new bridge that's pretty much done between Canada and the U.S., between Windsor and Detroit, the Gordie Howe International Bridge, which is close to opening, as I understand it. But now Donald Trump has threatened to block the opening of that bridge. Now, in his tweet, or his post on Truth Social, he posted about the bridge and how Canada's taken advantage of the U.S. somehow and made some erroneous claims about ownership of the bridge or how this all came to be. And basically, Canada said, we'll pay to build this bridge. But it is going to be jointly owned between Canada and the state of Michigan. Michigan obviously owns the land on the U.S. side of the border. There was U.S. steel, Canadian steel, U.S. workers, Canadian workers that built this bridge. And Canada is going to recoup some of those costs through tolls. It's really strange that Donald Trump all of a sudden landed on this issue as a way to try to put pressure on Canada. And again, he talks about other trade practices or the fact that Canada is establishing closer trade ties with China. There was also a report that came out that one of Trump's cabinet members had met with the owner of the competing bridge, the Ambassador Bridge between Canada and the U.S., or Windsor and Detroit, because he has long opposed this new bridge. Maybe there's some connection there. But it does illustrate how there's maybe signs of optimism, but still at the same time concerning signs, worrying signs about where things stand between Canada and the U.S. Now, Prime Minister Mark Carney on Tuesday did briefly speak to this and the questions about the threats around the bridge. The Prime Minister seemed pretty calm in responding to all of this.
So the first thing to say is there's a big game today, and the President and I discussed the Canada-U.S. game, and of course we're all behind our team. Secondly, we discussed a number of issues, international issues. Thirdly, we discussed the bridge. I explained that Canada, of course, paid for the construction of the bridge, over $4 billion, that the ownership is shared between the state of Michigan and the government of Canada, and that in the construction of the bridge, obviously there's Canadian steel, Canadian workers, but also U.S. steel, U.S. workers that are involved. This is a great example of cooperation between our countries. Look forward to it opening. And what is particularly important, of course, is the commerce and the tourism and the voyages of Canadians and Americans that will go across that bridge. So the conversation turned to a series of issues that we will raise and we're going to follow up on. I'm not going to go into detail on those issues. These would be specific issues in parallel to the CUSMA negotiations. Final point is the President asked appropriately that his ambassador, who's from Michigan, of course, play a role in smoothing the conversation in and around the bridge. So it was a positive conversation. It's a big game today, and we're going to win.
Okay, so maybe the Prime Minister just not wanting to take the bait here or exacerbate things even further. So we'll see where things go. I mean, there's been a lot of backlash in Michigan, by the sounds of it, to Donald Trump's threats. So maybe that will calm down. But still, I think there's an expectation that the Prime Minister tried to navigate all of this, trying to negotiate a deal still with the U.S. president, trying to preserve this trading relationship. So we'll see where that all goes. But I did want to unpack all of this much further to try to understand the significance of this vote this week, to try to better understand why things seem to have changed in the U.S. with regard to not just trade with Canada, but free trade and global trade altogether, and where all of this is headed. Very pleased to welcome to the program Bryan Riley. He is director of the Free Trade Initiative, the National Taxpayers Union of Washington, D.C., NTU.org. And he's been in this game a long time. Bryan, so great to have you with us.
Thanks for having me on. There's a lot going on.
Yeah, no kidding. Well, let's start with what happened this week, and maybe a hopeful sign, perhaps, that some sanity can prevail here. But let's talk about this vote in Congress this week regarding the tariffs on Canada specifically, or I guess the emergency that's justifying those tariffs. Now, the president, I suppose, could still veto this, but what was significant about that to you?
Well, this is the first time that the House of Representatives in the United States has voted on the tariffs imposed by President Trump, specifically IEEPA, emergency tariffs, so-called, allegedly because of the threat of illegal drugs crossing the northern border from Canada to the United States. I stress allegedly. And the Senate has voted a couple of times last year on the U.S.-Canada tariffs and had voted against them, but the House has not. They're supposed to vote every 6 months on this national emergency, but they've changed their rules to get out of voting as they're supposed to do under U.S. law. Well, they finally voted last week on the tariffs, and there weren't a lot of Republicans that joined Democrats, but there were enough, 6 Republicans that joined Democrats to vote against the national emergency, which would get rid of this specific set of tariffs that the Trump administration has imposed on Canada. So that was a good sign. Whether it's the start of more good things to come or not remains to be seen, of course. But for those of us who think trade is a good thing, we haven't had a lot of good news lately. So I'll take whatever wins we can get.
Yeah, no kidding. Now, there is at some point a decision coming from the U.S. Supreme Court about all of this, and it sort of alludes to some of these presidential powers, and maybe you could break that down for us, because when it comes to there's sort of the national emergency side, there's these other emergency powers that I guess the president has. Otherwise, this kind of is the purview of Congress. So explain what's underlying all of that.
Well, the Supreme Court could rule as soon as a week from today. There's no guarantee that they will, but they'll be announcing some decisions. Pretty much every time that there is an announcement from the court that they're going to announce decisions, everybody who's following this thinks, oh, this could be the day the Supreme Court will weigh in. And there are a couple of things that the court is looking at. The first is the constitutionality of the tariffs. As you alluded to, in the United States, our Constitution explicitly says under Article 1, Section 8 of our Constitution that Congress has authority over international commerce, has authority over taxation, has authority over duties, not the president. So what Congress has done a lot over the years, though, has delegate some of that authority to the president. Typically, it's been to allow the president to negotiate trade agreements with other countries, and then Congress would vote at the end of the day. But President Trump has really pushed the boundaries of those delegations to through the executive branch impose tariffs without congressional approval or consultations. There's also, in addition to the constitutional issue, a legal issue because the statute that President Trump used to impose tariff doesn't even authorize tariffs because the statute doesn't refer to tariffs. So there are a couple of things that the Supreme Court could point to and say, we're going to overturn these tariffs. And then, what happens after that, kind of we'll cross that bridge when we come to it. The justices were, when they had their oral hearings on this issue, had some very pointed questions to the Trump administration. And so initially there was a lot of speculation that the court would strike down the tariffs, but as this drags out, I think people are like not are being more guarded in our optimism, because the court could say, okay, we're going to keep the tariffs. They could say we're going to reject the tariffs, and you've got to refund everybody who's been paying these for the last year. Or they could do something in between, more complicated. So we're in wait and see mode. So we have that constitutional issue. In Congress, there have been bills introduced that have said in the future, President Trump, President whomever in the future, if you want to impose tariffs, that's fine, but you got to submit it to Congress, and we're going to vote on it before those tariffs go into effect. A lot of Republicans had supported such bills in the past, but when President Trump took office this time around, those Republicans changed their tune and haven't been willing to reassert that congressional authority.
It's interesting because then it gets sort of the question of what the point of these tariffs is, right? I mean, there's sort of this fentanyl emergency that was used to justify them initially, and then that kind of fell by the wayside. And is it about trying to get concessions from other countries? Is it just about building up that sort of wall of protection? Like what ultimately is the goal here, do you think, of the administration?
Yeah, that's the $1 million question. It seems to change from day to day. The simplest answer is that President Trump just doesn't like trade very much. He certainly doesn't like trade deficits, and thinks that he wants to use the tariff power to try and reduce trade deficits. And clearly, he has used tariffs in a way that few other presidents have. I'd say no other president has. He would say is a tool. Probably it's more accurate to call it a weapon, which is to try and coerce other people to take actions that aren't directly trade related. It could have to do with fentanyl. It could have to do with immigration. It could have to do with Greenland. A whole lot of different things. Where his default answer is we're going to put tariffs, or we're going to threaten tariffs at least. But a lot of the tariffs, including the ones the court is looking at, and others, are justified, despite all the points that you and I have just discussed. The legal justification is that there's some kind of national emergency or economic threat posed by tariffs. And that's a very radical departure from U.S. positions from presidents, Republican and Democrat, ever since World War II, which was more like, along the lines of we are stronger in the United States when we have more trade. When our allies are stronger, that helps us. When we can buy the inputs we need, whether it's aluminum from Canada, or whatever, that makes us stronger. It helps our economy, helps our national defense. So the emergency justification that President Trump has used is unprecedented. And my hope is that whatever happens in the next couple of years, that in the future we'll take a more maybe pragmatic or constructive view. When you use tariffs as a threat or as a weapon, I think a lot of times that works once. But eventually our trading partners are likely to say, no, you can't, we're not going to allow you to keep doing this over and over again, and they're going to start pushing back. That could be official government retaliation. We're putting tariffs on your goods. Or it could be, as we've seen with a lot of people in Canada, they just say, well, we're not visiting Florida anymore. We're not visiting Hawaii. We're not going skiing in the United States. We're not going to buy your goods. And those are things that are going to be hard to turn around when we've made people who should be our friends and made them, put them in a position where they can't really trust us anymore.
Yeah, on the issue of trade deficits or trade imbalances, and this has taken on a lot of significance, and I know the word deficit is kind of a bad word, which maybe in a budgetary sense it should be, but the significance of it here, because it does seem, if your worry is, look, that country over there doesn't buy enough from us, well, if you clobber them economically, they're probably going to buy even less from.
Well, absolutely. And one of the things I've repeatedly said is, as the Trump administration has touted these market opening trade deals, we just had one with Taiwan announced yesterday, and they've said these are open markets, we're going to have more exports. That deal in particular, the United States is leaving a 15% tariff in general on imports from Taiwan. It's pretty much along the same lines for any country. If we put that kind of tariff on imports from other countries, they're not going to earn as much. They're not going to be able to afford to buy as many of our exports. So we might import less, but we're also going to export less. There's not going to be any change to the trade deficit. And I do want to be clear from our perspective, and I think most economists would say, the point you mentioned, deficit is a word that sounds bad. Nobody likes budget deficits. Sounds like you're in the hole. Trade deficit, if from the U.S. side of things, or how I'm just going as an American, I'm going to talk about from the U.S. side of things. If we have a trade deficit with Canada, it doesn't mean that we owe something to Canada. It just means we imported more from Canada than Canada did from us. Those are just individual decisions freely made by Americans, and if we can afford to buy affordable petroleum from Canada or aluminum from Canada, and that results in a deficit, it doesn't mean we owe Canada money. It's not a deficit. It's a deficit, but it's not really a deficit. And if you look at all the international transactions, not just how much oil we buy or how much wheat we sell, but if you include investment flows, those all balance out. And I think most economists would tell you that one of the reasons that we in the United States have a trade deficit is that we've historically been a great place to invest in. And our trading partners, maybe instead of buying things, say, well, we're going to buy a share of Apple, or we're going to expand our auto production facilities in Tennessee or Kentucky, we benefit from that. So those are the things that I hope we would look at, and not just this trade deficit number that is not a good measure of the strength of the U.S. economy. If we grow and we're richer next year, we're probably going to import more goods, and the trade deficit's probably going to get bigger. Well, I'm fine with that, and I think most people should be as well. But that's not the way a lot of politicians look at things, unfortunately.
Well, it's interesting when we talk about inputs. I think there's or imports rather. I mean, there's the the products that end up on the shelves, and we see that they're made wherever, versus the idea of inputs, right? And I mean, a tariff applies to all of it. But you mentioned, I mean, oil from Canada is kind of an input because U.S. refineries, make gasoline from that or other fuels. The Financial Times reporting today that maybe the Trump administration's looking at easing tariffs on steel and aluminum because that's an input, right? That American companies use to manufacture products. So what about the impact of tariffs on the input side and ultimately on manufacturing, for example?
Well, it's very significant. Over half of U.S. imports are either raw materials that we just talked about, they're intermediate goods like parts, they're capital goods like computing equipment and machinery that we use to make other things. So when we put tariffs or import taxes on those goods, we're literally making it harder for U.S. producers, whether you're a manufacturer and you need those inputs. Farm producers have really been hurt by our trade actions, not just in terms of the losing access to foreign markets, but having to pay higher prices for machinery that's made out of steel, for fertilizer, for herbicides. There are exemptions to some of those tariffs, to some of those goods, but many of them still are subject to tariffs. So that drives up costs for American companies and makes us less competitive. And it's really smaller businesses that pay the brunt of these tariffs. If you're a bigger business, you have ways to manage your cash flows, probably have better connections in Congress or the administration to try and get some treatment to make things work better. But if you're a small business, it's a lot tougher to deal with. And if in many cases, if you have a couple bad months, you're out of business, and that's really the unfortunate reality that we're facing in the United States. I'm an economist. I'm not a political advisor, but it's going to be fascinating to see how this plays out in November when we have what are called our congressional midterm elections, because I think most people here would tell you the main reason Trump got elected was because Americans were concerned about high prices and inflation. And what do tariffs do? They increase prices, among other things. States. And there's not a lot of love based on every poll that I've seen among Americans for these tariffs. And if that has some electoral repercussions, it's going to cause a lot of people in Congress to reconsider these tariffs. And, we'll certainly see what happens. But there was the unique thing about these tariffs, one of the many unique things, is there's not some groundswell of demand in the U.S. to do this. It's top-down, driven by the Trump administration and President Trump himself. In many cases, over the objections, not just to consumers who don't want higher prices, but of businesses who you look at North American supply chains, for example. The last thing almost any business would tell you is, we should pull out of the U.S.-Mexico-Canada agreements. But that's what President Trump's threatening to do. But would he do it or not? I have no idea. It could just be one of those threats that you mentioned earlier to get leverage on things. But the uncertainty of not knowing what's going to happen from day to day and week to week is not helping Americans as well.
What about who pays tariffs, or kind of even just how tariffs work, right? As you alluded to, I mean, the possibility that some of these tariffs would be refunded in the U.S., but it's not like Canada's getting a check for those. And it's the same thing, right? If Canada imposes tariffs on the U.S., it's not like the U.S. Treasury is writing the Canadian government a check. Like, importers pay those tariffs, right? So, I think Trump is trying to sort of frame it that way, that we put tariffs on Canada, we put tariffs on China, they're giving us money somehow. But that's obviously not how this works.
That's obviously not how this works, right? Yeah, and most Americans understand that. It is, by law, it's the U.S. importer who pays. Now, if you are a big U.S. company, retailer, manufacturer, what may happen initially is you can eat some of those costs and not pass them along to consumers. And that's what has happened this last year. But you can't do that forever. And eventually those costs get passed along to the end buyer. But even if you're the company that eats those costs, that takes out of your profits, that takes out of your ability to expand and to hire new workers. So either way, it hurts us. Now, theoretically, it's possible that our trading partners, we import something from France, and France may say, well, we're just going to lower our prices to offset the tariffs. That's a theoretical possibility, but the studies are starting to roll in, and they're starting to show the same thing that we should have learned during Trump's first term, is that these tariffs are paid by Americans. They don't show up on the invoice or on the sales slip, but they contribute to higher prices. I talk to people every week who will say, I've ordered something, or I was going to order something, and it came with this list of charges, not just tariffs, but paperwork fees, shipping fees from the various cargo and shipping companies that weren't there a year ago or 2 years ago. So people are seeing these costs, and they are paid by Americans. There's a discussion of whether they contribute to our overall inflation level or not. And regardless of the impact on inflation, I don't think there's any doubt that if you put a 15% tax on a particular product coming from a particular company, that's going to cost more. Now, other prices may go down as a result because we don't have as much money to spend on other goods. So the overall price level impact is something different. Clearly, if we put a 15% tax on avocados, the cost of avocados is going to go up. That's bad. We're not going to be able to export as much. That's bad. It's really, somebody yesterday, I think, told me this is the biggest self-own that the U.S. has done in memory. It's very disappointing.
So now the future of the USMCA or CUSMA, as we call it on this side of the border, is in doubt. I mean, the first Trump term, we were sort of worried about what was going to happen with NAFTA. We came up with this new trade agreement, which I guess more or less was, kept most of that in place. But now it's possible that the USMCA is not going to be replaced by something. The whole North American free trade market is kind of in question here. What's your read of where things are at?
Well, what's supposed to happen under the agreement is that there's a 6-year review, and the countries decide whether they want to extend it for another 16 years. It's not intended to be an automatic renegotiation of the agreement, but some in the United States, at least, are pushing to renegotiate aspects of the agreement. The other thing is, in the past, what are the benefits to the U.S. of joining agreements like U.S. CUSMA or NAFTA or the World Trade Organization? Is that there are rules in place to enforce the promises, the commitments that each country has made. I would certainly question, and a lot of people question, what even is the point of these agreements if the U.S. is just going to do whatever they want and essentially flout the rules, ignore the rules. I do believe that the Trump administration has tried to respect its commitments to USMCA in many ways. It's emergency tariffs that are being considered by the Supreme Court. It exempted most goods that were compliant with the North American trade agreement from those tariffs. But even so, the average tariff that we in the U.S. apply to Canadian goods is hard. I say the average tariff on Canada, as you point out, it's really the tariff on Americans who import goods from Canada. Before this all started, was less than 1%, much less than 1%. Now it's over 3%. Which doesn't sound very high, but relative to where we were before this, it's significant. And when you have, let's say you're building a car and the parts are going back and forth between the U.S. and Canada or Canada and Mexico, those really add to the costs. And then as mentioned earlier, just the uncertainty that you have, that I have, that every manufacturer or agriculture producer has, trying to project what decisions should we make, what crop should we plant next month, how many cars should we produce. It's very challenging to make those decisions when you don't know, are we going to be in USMCA next month or next year? So you make your best guesses and move on, but just that uncertainty, aside from the tariff cost, the uncertainty cost is not helping our economy in the United States. And we're alienating our not just business partners, but our diplomatic partners as well. So there are a lot of long-term costs in addition to these short-term economic disruptions. It's all right, it's worth it because we're getting all these countries to buckle under it and do things. Well, a lot of times we will announce some big win and then our trading partner will come back and say, well, no, that's not really what we agreed to,
Right. Well, and I think too, I think for free traders on this side of the border, there's some potential silver lining here. Like, supply management gets a lot of attention, right? These sky high tariffs that Canada has on dairy and poultry products, which ultimately mean that Canadians pay more for those products. If all of this, tension leads to some positive changes there, then maybe that's a net positive. But there is still lingering protection in Canada. There is lingering protectionism elsewhere, right? There's a lot of that still that's out there.
Yeah, absolutely. There's always room for improvement. As you mentioned in Canada, same thing in the U.S. We have politically powerful industries that have special carve-outs from these deals. Another silver lining, not so much for the United States, but the rest of the world is cutting trade deals left and right. And when I say trade deals, I mean more traditional, reciprocal, zero tariff or low tariff trade deals. There's the European Union and India, Europe and Latin America, UK joining the Trans-Pacific Partnership, as it used to be called. So a lot of other countries are realizing, look, we can't have all our eggs in one basket. We need to take this opportunity to secure better markets with other countries. And I know that our president has had different statements relating to Canada doing more business with China. Well, the U.S. does a bunch of business with China as well. So I think countries more and more are considering their options, and considering that there are other options besides relying entirely on the United States, and that's something that's unfortunate.
Well,
Unfortunate for the United States, to be
yeah.
frank.
The agriculture one's interesting. Like in Canada, for example, I mean, when it comes to NAFTA or USMCA or Trans-Pacific Partnership, you've got industries like beef or grain or lentils, these kinds of products where these producers want these free trade agreements. They want these markets. They export a lot. They're efficient, productive industries. Whereas the ones that are protected by tariffs, protected by quotas and regulations, they don't export. They tend not to be really all that efficient. Is that one of the consequences of when you try to protect an industry through tariffs or the protectionisms, that ultimately that industry doesn't thrive as much as it otherwise would?
That's been the lesson of history, that those protected industries, they don't have the competitive pressure to improve if they have a guaranteed market, and don't have to compete. Then they invest more of their resources in lobbying the government for continued protection, as opposed to improving and modernizing, to become more competitive. That's exactly right. And you make an important point as well. Here we'll talk about, well, agriculture needs this, and most of the agricultural sector does want more exports, but what beef producers want and is different than what wheat producers want, which is different than what strawberry producers in Florida wants, or in the U.S. Our sugar producers, who've just been very successful at walling off sugar imports in order to protect their markets. And as a result, if you're a candy manufacturer or a bakery manufacturer, and you have the opportunity to move to Canada or move to Mexico or someplace else where you can get your input at a more affordable price, companies have done that. But if you're like a Main Street candy maker, and you can't relocate to another country, and you've just got to pay more for the most important ingredient you have, that's going to harm you. And the one of the disappointing things to me is countries around the world look to the U.S. for leadership, and I think especially in the developing countries could look to Canada, look to North America, look at what happened with Mexico after 1994 when NAFTA was approved, and realize we got to get away from this protectionism, because it's just leaving us with these antiquated, uncompetitive businesses. And by getting rid of tariffs, it allows them to be more competitive. It forces them to be more competitive. It also allows them to attract more investment, because like the Asian tigers, or even in China, it's slashed their tariffs, and as a result, international investors figured, well, we can go produce there and bring it in the inputs and make things more affordably, take advantage of those opportunities. But protectionism has costs. I would say, recap my long-winded statement more briefly, which is one of those costs is that if companies feel like, well, we've got an opportunity to profit by lobbying Congress or telling the president to crack down on imports, that's money that could be used to help them be more competitive, and instead they use it for lobbying. And in the United States, just look at the numbers, which are reported every month here in the United States. Trade lobbyists, the business is booming. So that's one area that's thriving as a result of these tariffs.
It's interesting to see the consensus, and maybe this is helping to build a new consensus, at least globally, about the value of free trade. I mean, I think back to when Ronald Reagan and Brian Mulroney negotiated the free trade agreement. We had a big election in 1988 where the liberals ran hard against that agreement. The liberals in '93 said they were going to get rid of NAFTA, but eventually they came around. So instead of that partisan divide, there became a real consensus about the value of free trade, and I think we're sort of seeing that again today. What's been, do you see the evolution of this in the US, where, the Democrats were previously against NAFTA, for example? It was Ronald Reagan and George Bush who brought in these trade agreements, where now maybe the Republicans have shifted a bit. We've been reminded of some of the differences between Ronald Reagan and now Donald Trump on these issues.
Yeah, I think that, and that's a great question. And you're correct about the Democrats in the U.S. typically being more pro-union, and in recent decades, and it was really presidents like Reagan driving these trade agreements. But up from a presidential level, Bill Clinton and even Barack Obama, who came into office with skepticism, really, in terms of policies, were pretty supportive of trade. It was more Democrats or members of Congress who are from certain states that felt like they were getting left behind, that were more likely to oppose trade. Certainly, currently, popular opinion shows that Democratic voters in the U.S. are more opposed to tariffs. It's always been that way, but it's been labor unions and some of the more progressive or left-wing groups that have a lot of influence in the Democratic Party who've said, no, we can't support this. But the House vote to get rid of the tariffs on Canada, every Democrat but one voted to get rid of the tariffs. Now, whether that is because they are newfound free traders and will be into the future, or they just wanted to stick it to President Trump, or some combination, that will remain to be seen. A lot of Republican elected officials, when you read what they say off the record, or when I talk to staffers who work for some of these, who work for Republican office, for example, they will often say, look, we don't like the tariffs. Our constituents don't like the tariffs. The farmers are complaining. The small businesses are complaining. The retailers are complaining. Big businesses are nobody likes this stuff. But I'm a Republican, and President Trump's a Republican, and I don't want to pick a fight or disagree with the president, and that's still on the Republican side of things. That's what's driving most of the Republican elected officials. Does that go away once, if President Trump is out of office? Do we, in the U.S., return to a more Reagan-like outlook, or has the MAGA trade is bad view really taken over and seized the Republican Party? That will be a really important indication of where we're going in the future. So will there be this rebalance where we flip back to Republicans being the part of protectionism and Democrats the party of free trade? Will both parties be opposed to trade? Or is there a chance that there'll be a better consensus in support of trade? I think anything is possible at this stage. And I try to be optimistic, and of course encourage more support for trade, because from our perspective, we represent the interests of U.S. taxpayers. We're the ones who pay for these tariffs. And really, all free trade is that whether you're in Canada or the United States, if you earn your paycheck, you ought to decide how you spend and save and invest those dollars. Those decisions shouldn't be made by political leaders based on who's got the most clout. So that's the message that we will continue to try and push here in DC. And to be honest, we might be following the lead of other countries around the world, and maybe we can learn something from them.
Well, let's hope for the best, I guess, is a good place to leave it. Much more at ntu.org. Bryan Riley, appreciate your insight on all of this. Thank you so much for joining us here.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Nice talking to you.
All right. Well, our thanks once again to Bryan Riley. Again, he's director of the Free Trade Initiative of the National Taxpayers Union in Washington, D.C. NTU.org is their website. So we appreciate his insight on all of this. And I guess we'll hope for the best, but maybe at the same time prepare for the worst. We'll see what happens as we move forward here with CUSMA renegotiations, with this pending U.S. Supreme Court decision, with maybe hopefully an evolving or changing political dynamic in Washington, D.C. And I think in the meantime, it's incumbent on Canada to try to build trading relationships elsewhere. And maybe from all of this comes a new consensus about the value of free trade. So let's work at building some of those new trading relationships too. And I think that goes hand in hand with, building a new pipeline to the West Coast, for example. So I think it's going to be a pretty pivotal year on that front, and we'll see what happens. Now, we played for you what the Prime Minister had to say on Tuesday. I guess it was Tuesday morning. And we was asked about the president's threats around the Gordie Howe International Bridge. He talked about his conversation with Donald Trump and where all of that's going. So that was Tuesday morning. The Prime Minister responded to that. Very soon after, of course, the Prime Minister's attention, really everybody's attention, shifted to Tumbler Ridge, BC, and the horrors that unfolded there, this mass shooting that left 8 victims, a total of 9 people dead, including the shooter. As we record this podcast on Friday morning, we understand there's a 12-year-old girl who was a victim in this, who is still fighting for her life in hospital in BC. And so I know that this all looms very large in the hearts and minds of Canadians right across the country. And we join them in offering our thoughts and condolences to everybody affected by this and wishing for the best for this young girl fighting in hospital and everyone who's dealing with the aftermath of this horrible situation. Listen, that's where we'll leave it for this episode of the Rob Breakenridge Show. You can find us at our website, robbreakenridge.ca. You can find this podcast on audio platforms like Spotify, Apple Podcast, Amazon Music, also our YouTube channel. Find video there, youtube.com/Rob Breakenridge Show. Do hope you have an enjoyable weekend. Of course, Monday is Family Day in much of the country, so an opportunity, I hope, to spend some time with family, with loved ones. So enjoy it, make the most of it, folks, and we'll be back with you next week. Talk to you then. Take care. Hey, folks, thanks for watching and listening. You can find us at robbreakenridge.ca. Also, make sure you hit that subscribe button below and stay connected with the Rob Breakenridge Show.